not on mute yet. I will do a short introduction of our webinar now. Yeah, so just to repeat the housekeeping rules, that the microphones should be switched off and the cameras as well. You are invited to ask questions. Actually, we would be happy to have your questions in the chat box. We reserve the time for answering the questions, and we want the webinar to be interactive. If the session ends unexpectedly, then please reconnect using the same link. The presentations and the recording of the webinar will be available at the EU4Green website shortly after the webinar. The copyrights of the webinar belong to the Environmental Agency, Austria. The agenda for today, we have the topic of climate risk management. And now I'm doing a short introduction, and afterwards we have the colleague from Environment Agency Austria, Teresa Doibeli-Huang. She will talk about understanding the climate risks and their implications for the financial sector. And then afterwards, we have one more presentation from Dr. Radman Selmic, advisor to the President for Green Circular Economy at the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Serbia. And Dr. Selmic will talk about management of climate risks in the financial sector. The learning objectives of today's webinars are about understanding what are the climate risks, how they are defined. Also, what does it mean to have the climate risk and how it relates to economy and finance in Europe and also in the Western Balkans. How to manage different types of climate risks and how the climate risks are relevant for the Western Balkans and for the finance sector. What is happening already in respect of management of climate risks in the region. I will introduce shortly our project. So the project runs from 22 till 2025, and it is financed by European Commission and with the Austrian contribution from the Austrian Development Agency, with the implementation party as Environment Agency Austria. The objective of the project is to support the Western Balkans economies for implementation of Green Agenda and to get the economies closer to accession to the European Union. We have our website, and I invite you also to visit the website and use it for additional information. The project covers 4 outcomes. The first one is on environment, the pollution water, the pollution soil, the pollution air, circular economy, sustainable finance, biodiversity, and decarbonization. And the outcome 2 focuses on activities around monitoring and reporting. The outcome 3 focuses on activities around communication, civil society organizations, involvement, and education. Our outcome, the green finance, covers activities around green finance. So this webinar is a part of the work plan for green finance outcome. The implementing body for this project is Environment Agency Austria. We are the most important environmental expert organization in Austria and one of the leading environment organizations in Europe. We have more than 35 years of experience. We have more than 600 experts and own laboratories working with more than 55 scientific disciplines with a lot of languages and covering more than 60 countries. And with this, I will give over to my colleague Teresa for her presentation. Thank you, and wish you a nice session today with us.
Sorry, Olga and Teresa, before we going into the presentations, we have prepared a little bit of a more interactive part, and with that also welcome from my side. My name is Hanna Bartels. I'm also part of the Environment Agency Austria and a colleague of Olga and Teresa in this regard. And yes, I'm going to have the pleasure today to sort of moderate the more interactive part. I will just quickly share my screen. Yes, I hope you can see it. Yes, I hope you can see it. Say so if not. For those of you who have joined last time, we're going to use a similar tool, which is called Bcast, to sort of get your opinions on different questions, but also learn a little bit more about the audience which we are talking to today in order, to get to know you a little bit better as well. And in order to do this, I would kindly ask you to go to the website mybcast.com, which is indicated here. Maybe you could also use the QR code if you're joining from your phone, but I think usually laptop works a little better. Anyway, both is possible. And if you have entered the website, please use the session code to join today's session. And please also stay on it throughout the whole webinar because we're going to come back to Bcast a few more times. And we don't want to miss out on your input on Bcast as well. So I hope that some of you have already managed to join on Bcast. So the session code and the website that you can use will always stay up on the website, even if I move forward throughout the exercises. So yeah, please don't hesitate to step in anytime. Even if you'll close it, you can always re-enter on the website using the session code. All right, with that, I'm going to start with a little bit of an icebreaker. So I hope this is visible for everyone. We have a little graph here, and on the x-axis indicated is your level of motivation today. So 0 would be none, 5 would be highly motivated, and on the y-axis we have the cups of coffee today, starting from 0 cups to 5 cups. And I would kindly ask you to indicate for both answers, one, what I want to be answering, so ideal answer, and then what my answer actually is. So a little bit of, more truth in this regard. And it's a drag and drop system. So you can drop these two, the red and the blue dot, just right into the graph, and we can see your answers. So please don't hesitate to do so. And I will give you a little bit of time to be able to get on the website and enter the code and put your answers. All right, some answers have already come in. So we see that coffee level is in ideal and also realistic terms not too high, which I guess is good for blood pressure, etc. And motivation is not too low, also in realistic terms, which I mean we're very grateful for. Yes. Okay. Just wait a few more seconds and see if the dots keep moving. But I think it has stabilized on a level like that. So I think we could also move on to the second part of the survey. Okay, some people are still voting. Okay, great. Thank you so much for participating. And with that, we're going to move on to the second exercise, in which we're interested in seeing where you're joining from today. So please indicate your economy, region, other, wherever you're joining from today. Okay, great. So the wheel is spinning and we have quite a diverse composition, which is great. So I think we have answers from every economy and also other, which I'm very happy to see. And for those of you who have joined a little later, I've seen that participants came in. I still invite you to join the website mybcast.com and enter the session code. So you're also able to give your answers here and show us a little bit more about who you are and where, and your opinions later on also, but also where you're joining from today. Yes, please don't hesitate. Great, we still have a few more answers coming in. And yes, as I said, great to see that many people from different regions are joining in today. Yeah, perfect. I think with that, I'm going to move on to the last part of the getting to know you exercise at the beginning of our webinar, which is learning a bit more about your job descriptions. So I would kindly ask you to enter your job title and submit it. And then ideally it will show up in a word cloud. Yeah. Okay. It seems to work. Perfect. So we have project managers, green finance expert, which is great, finance officer, a researcher, climate specialist, also very great. So I see it's more or less diverse crowd as well that we're talking to today, which is great, obviously. Coordination of EU funds, very valuable. I see project manager still sort of stands out, which makes sense. Senior officer development, environmental consultant, great. So all in all, I believe it's quite diverse audience we're speaking to today, which I think makes sense because the topic of climate risk and climate risk management also needs various angles in tackling. So yes, thank you very much for joining today and indicating your job description and area of expertise as well. And with that, I think we will move on to our first presentation, which is coming from Teresa. Maybe Teresa will also shortly introduce herself and her team, and give us the first input on what climate risks actually are. Yes, Teresa, please have the floor.
We don't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, apologies for that. I hope that it works now. All right, I'll just repeat that for those who didn't hear. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Teresa Davelli Huang. I work at the Environment Agency Austria together with Olga, Hanna, and Nina. But I work in the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Expert team. And I'm excited to talk about something that's not so exciting, actually, since it is one of the most pressing challenges that we're all facing. And that's, of course, climate change and managing that, the risks that come from it. Many of you may have already realized that climate change is not really a distant threat. It's actually something that's happening now. From floods to prolonged droughts, we see that the impacts of climate change are touching every sector. And today I have the pleasure to speak to you about how we can bridge the gap from understanding these risks, especially as they affect the economy and the financial sector, to trying to take action and leading over to the second presentation. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll discuss climate risk trends, financial impacts, and also touch upon some strategies for building resilience. And then, of course, we'll have the chance to chat a bit and reflect on your questions. But for now, let's jump into the next slide and let's begin with the presentation. So you can see on the slide that the global context is really urgent. Already in 2023, we saw that global temperatures reached almost 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the predictions for this year indicate a rise that's even bigger, 1.6 degrees Celsius. And that's a tipping point closer than we might have expected previously. And these figures really do underline the speed at which the climate crisis is accelerating. And temperature increases, of course, aren't linear. They amplify hazards like wildfires, hurricanes, and heat waves. For example, the heat waves in Europe that we've seen this past summer have disrupted the agriculture sector. They have disrupted various infrastructures. And I think also for many of us, they have had a heavy toll on our work lives. At the Environment Agency, we actually also have experienced them quite strongly because we don't have air conditions. And that's just something that's experienced all across Europe more and more. And of course, the Western Balkans is experiencing the brunt of that too. And this highlights also two critical factors. We see a growing intensity of hazards, but we also see a varying capacity of societies to respond. And to tackle these hazards and this challenge, it really requires action that's not just at the individual national level, but actually that is a coordinated global effort. So let's go to the next slide. To see that in Europe, climate change is manifesting through more intense and frequent extreme weather events. Some of you may have heard of the 2024 European Climate Risk Assessment, and this report really shows the rising temperatures. It shows longer droughts, and it shows that Europe across the continent is facing more severe flooding too. And these, of course, are not just environmental phenomena. They have really far-reaching socioeconomic consequences. For example, heat waves, I've mentioned it before, they affect our productivity as we work in offices, but they also affect agricultural outputs and crop yields. And that, of course, can then create food supply chain issues. At the same time, floods in Central Europe or elsewhere really end up damaging critical infrastructures. And that in turn, of course, can have cascading effects on other not directly affected industrial sectors. So it really underscores the interconnected nature of climate impacts. And it also shows that if we fail to take measures to mitigate these, then the challenges will escalate and they will end up affecting not just vulnerable, directly impacted regions, but actually Europe as a whole. Let's go to the next slide. Here, I'll quickly talk about the concept of tipping points. You may have heard about this. I mentioned it also in the beginning, that climate tipping points are starting to be breached. This concept of tipping points illustrates how small changes can trigger irreversible impacts. And scientists increasingly warn that we are approaching these thresholds in the next decade and much faster than we initially thought. Maybe a very familiar threshold, or one that you've heard about, is the melting of polar ice caps or the collapse of the Amazon rainforests and disruptions to the ocean currents. And for those who are not familiar with what that actually could mean, it's really, really bad. So crossing these points could have cascading effects globally, from rising sea levels, flooding coastal cities, to biodiversity loss, which in turn can also undermine food systems. At the end of the day, the key takeaway is really we just don't have unlimited time and we need to take action, because procrastination on addressing climate change and the related risks will lead to much higher costs in the future. And these costs, they're economic, they're human, and they're also ecological. And one key issue that relates to the economy is really that many economies, as it looks now, could remain largely unprepared for these nonlinear impacts of climate change, especially as adaptation efforts, unfortunately, are unlikely to radically progress over the next decades, particularly in the most climate vulnerable economies. So let's go to the next slide and dive a bit deeper into how climate change is actually really everyone's business. They have already started to get the gist of it. Climate change really is not a siloed issue. It's a systemic challenge. And hazards like droughts, floods, and heat waves, they interact with social vulnerabilities, such as inequality or poor infrastructure. And the result, of course, is cascading risks. So you can see in the slide on the right how these cascading risks can affect and cross-affect various sectors. So, for example, think of a single flood in a one specific location. This single flood, of course, it has a direct impact. It triggers economic losses in the affected area. It triggers human losses in some cases in the affected area. It causes disruptions to the infrastructure. And as a result, we can see that healthcare systems are strained. Education systems may actually stop or just be disrupted. And that may actually be something that's not just in the short moment, in the immediate aftermath of a flood, but it can take much, much longer. It can take months and years to rebuild the healthcare systems, the education systems, the infrastructures that support those. And so then in turn, it can really compound long-term development opportunities. And in financial terms, of course, damages to infrastructure, they can cause losses that ripple through insurance markets. They can affect credit ratings, and they can reduce public investment capacity as public budgets are strained to respond to the damages and rebuild. So really, climate change is interconnected, and it's something that's everyone's business. And it's everyone's business, from governments to corporations to communities to everyone who's listening today, every individual. Let's go to the next slide. And it's everyone's business also because the financial costs of not taking action is staggering. So in the EU, you can see on the slide that climate-related extreme events already result in millions of euros in damages annually. And these figures are actually a lot bigger if you not only include the direct impacts, such as infrastructure repair, house repair, rebuilding, reconstruction. But if you also include the indirect losses, such as from disrupted trade or from disrupted productions or productivity declines as they result, for example, from prolonged heat. One example is the 2021 floods in Germany, which devastated the Ruhr region and really shook everyone and woke everyone up in a way, because it wasn't a country that thought to be quite prepared. But it ended up showing that, in fact, it was not prepared to respond to the challenge brought on by climate change, because the rainfall was record-breaking, and the floods cost more than 40 billion euros, actually, and claimed more than 180 lives. And until today, infrastructures, homes, and businesses are rebuilding, and the impact was just devastating. And it shows how even systems that seemingly are prepared struggle to cope with extreme events. And I think in the Western Balkans, that's also something that many of you may be familiar with. Just in October, there were devastating floods in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The rivers were overflowing, towns were inundated, and thousands of people ended up being displaced. And early estimates are already indicating that the damages to agriculture and housing were really significant. And it just underlines how important it is that we start thinking and acting on building climate resilience. Because at the end of the day, every euro that we spend on climate adaptation and risk reduction, it doesn't actually only prevent massive losses, but it also ends up strengthening long-term economic stability as we face climate-related risks. So let's go to the next slide. Because now I want to talk a little bit about how the financial sector is really at the front line of climate-related risks. And there are two challenges that are faced. One are the physical risks. I already started talking a bit about them, and I will talk about them some more as we go through the next slides. They're the ones that usually one thinks of first when one hears climate-related risks, I would argue. They're the direct impacts from climate events. So the direct consequences of floods, hurricanes, or wildfires, and the direct damages to physical assets and the disrupted operations. So to make this a bit more tangible, for example, a factory that's located in a flood-prone area, they might face operational downtime, they might face inventory losses from floods, and of course also higher insurance costs if they can have insurance at all, given that they are in a flood-prone area. And all of that is, of course, affecting the company's financial health in one way or another. But then The less obvious aspect of climate-related risks actually relates to transition risks. So transition risks are the risks that arise from the policy, market, and technological shifts that are needed to move to a low carbon economy, which of course we also need to do in order to mitigate climate-related risks to some extent. So these could include, for example, the tightening of EU emission standards, which could devalue coal plants and in turn could turn them into stranded assets. So stranded assets are investments that really quickly lose their financial value. And these transition risks are especially pressing thus in regions where fossil fuels are still making up a large share of the energy mix. And that's of course because as green energy sources are becoming preferred or required, investors will also increasingly favor sustainable and renewable energy projects over coal and other unsustainable ones. At the end of the day, though, all the risks are really interconnected. And insurance companies, banks, and investors, they're all exposed. And this can be through rising payouts, loan defaults, or market volatility. So it's really, integrating climate risks into financial planning. It's really not just a mitigation or risk reduction strategy. It's becoming something that's essential for long-term financial stability. But in the next slides, we'll delve a little bit deeper into these risks, into the two categories of risks, and we'll try to understand the specific implications for Europe and the Western Balkans. So in Europe, the physical risks, like floods and wildfires, they are actually facing significant threats to economic stability. So for example, the heat waves in 2022, they ended up causing power grid failures in some parts of Europe. They ended up causing water shortages, especially in the south of Europe. And at the same time, wildfires damaged large parts of the Mediterranean forests, disrupting also the very important tourism sector. And so, of course, these risks have a financial dimension because, as I was mentioning just before, it's the cost of insurance, but it's also the pressure to rebuild that's both on individuals and individual businesses and on governments. And at the same time, it's also about investors seeing declining returns in the affected regions. So let's go to the next slide. Because actually, the Western Balkans, unfortunately, is really, really vulnerable to climate change. So in the Western Balkans, as many of you may know, we're facing rising temperatures, and with that come more frequent droughts. But we also are facing more extreme weather and heavier precipitation events. And all that together, it really threatens agriculture, it threatens food security, and it can also threaten economic stability. So over the past 50 years, the temperatures in the Western Balkans have risen by about 1.2 degrees Celsius, and precipitation has decreased. What we've also seen is that outdoor workers are already losing quite a lot of hours annually to heat stress. And flood, wildfires, and landslides, they're really intensifying. So for example, in Albania in 2017, 15,000 hectares of crops were destroyed by floods. 144,000 hectares were destroyed regionally in 2021 by wildfires. And we also are seeing that landslides, especially those worsened by erosion and poor urban planning, are threatening regions across the Western Balkans. In Albania, for example, more than half of the land is at risk of landslides. So we're really seeing a landscape where there are escalating risks that require cooperation, regional cooperation amongst businesses, amongst different stakeholders, and they require planners to really aim for climate resilient development. Go to the next slide. In terms of economic impacts, the World Bank predicts that climate-related risks will have significant impacts on GDP. So they're projecting under the RCP 4.5 scenarios, you can see it here on the slide, there's projecting that there will be significant losses from floods, droughts, and labor heat stress. Of course, flooding is expected to cause the largest economic damages. but this will no longer be the only issue. Productivity is really starting to see an impact from the region getting hotter and drier. And of course, agriculture also is a critical sector that makes the climate-related risks even more consequential for the economies that rely heavily on rain-fed crops. At the same time, the financial pressures that result from the physical risks for governments are not to be underestimated, because quite usually it's public budgets that end up absorbing a large share of the costs of disaster relief and infrastructure repair. And without targeted investments in adaptation, for example, flood defenses and climate resilient infrastructures, these climate-related contingent liabilities on government budgets, they will grow, and they may constrain fiscal space and economic development, and they may even outweigh the fiscal capacities if action isn't taken at the scale that's required. There's, of course, the hope that economic growth could help offset some of these pressures. And under an optimistic growth scenario, projected GDP losses are reduced compared to the trend growth. But it ends up depending really on countries' investments in climate risk management and also their respective reliance on capital-intensive sectors and their exposure to climate risks. So let's go to the next slide and look a little bit at how exactly physical risks impact financial markets. So you can see it here on the slide. There's various ways that physical risks affect companies. You can see that physical risks disrupt companies' cash flows. They can increase insurance premiums where insurance is available, and they can also weaken asset values. So for example, for banks, the exposure is quite clear. They face higher defaults on loans that are tied to climate vulnerable sectors like real estate and agriculture. For example, properties that are in flood-prone areas, they might lose value. It might even not be possible to sell them anymore. And as a result, default risks for the mortgage holders are really increasing. The same is true that if insurers do not cover or can no longer cover the risks, then the financial burden shifts first, of course, to the individuals holding the properties, but then also to governments and markets that are making up for the losses and stepping in where individuals can no longer finance the risk themselves. So you can see that there is really an interplay that highlights the need for really robust risk management frameworks across the financial sector. Let's go to the next slide to understand that physical climate risks are inherently transboundary also. So that means that they're not concentrated to one specific location and they don't stop at borders. They spread across regions and they spread across sectors. And you can see it here on this slide that the interconnections, they're manifold, and that there's various transmission channels that connect the risk transmission channels. So for example, trade and supply chains. So imagine there's a flood in your neighboring country, but it disrupts supply chains. It disrupts the production in a company that produces some of the foods that supply super RICs in your country. So the result can really be that you're seeing increasing costs in that specific food item. And I think some of us may have already noticed this over the last years. Olive oil actually ended up getting a lot more expensive this year as a result of the wildfires in Greece that were disrupting the harvest. And this can, of course, become more and more pronounced as climate change amplifies the risks. At the same time, especially in regions that share ecosystems, water stress in one country can end up affecting the shared rivers and actually impact the neighboring regions. The same thing is true for financial networks. So if you have a financial shock due to a climate-induced event in one country, then that can actually cascade through interconnected financial markets, and it can end up affecting neighboring economies. And so what that really highlights is the need for regional cooperation in managing climate risks. Climate risks, they really do not respect borders. They don't care where one municipality ends and the other starts. So working across these borders is really just fundamental to manage them. And as part of that, of course, sharing data, harmonizing policies, and coordinating efforts it's just so important to ensure that the risks do not materialize in a devastating way. But let's go into the other side of climate-related risks. Let's talk a little bit about the transition risks. Because of course, we've spent now quite a lot of time discussing the immediate and tangible challenges that Europe and the Western Balkans are facing from physical risks from climate change. But let's not forget about the transition risks, because those risks arising from the economic and structural shifts needed to mitigate climate change, they can also have important impacts. So many of you may know that as Europe is moving toward its climate goals, especially under the European Green Deal, we need to take action and really shift in how our economy works, and this is causing transition risks. Because the low carbon economy is not something that comes easily. It requires industries and sectors that are still dependent on fossil fuels to really undergo structural transformations. For example, the rise in carbon pricing, but also tightening regulations, and as a result, changing market preferences, it will speed up the devaluation of fossil fuel-based assets, and it ends up leaving traditional industries quite vulnerable. And the financial sector is then also facing the challenge of managing these risks. So for banks and investors, it's not easy to adapt to this changing landscape. And in the economy, especially in the larger economies in Europe, it's the efforts to diversify the energy sources, they're already well underway. But the pace of the transition, it's not the same everywhere in the continent. And some regions and sectors are exposed to greater risks due to their historical reliance on carbon-intensive industries. And I think with that, we can go into the next slide and talk a little bit about the Western Balkan context, because of course here there's a particularly challenging scenario that's being faced, and that is this heavy dependence on coal for energy production and industrial activities. And also in the Western Balkans, as the EU drives forward with the green transition, there is impacts that are being felt. It makes the region more vulnerable to economic disruptions brought on by decarbonization policies and the shift to renewable energy. And it really means that there's one primary risk. A continued reliance on coal power plants is actually putting these power plants at risk of becoming stranded assets. Because sooner or later, decarbonization policies will advance and eventually will make these plants financially unviable. And that can really create economic challenges. It can for example, it can cause massive job losses, both in mining the coal, but then also in the power generation sectors. And that can really then, in turn, if not managed well, end up trigger social and political instability. So there's a huge risk that's in this transition. It's of course at the end of the day, if the transition is well managed, it's a positive. It will be a positive outcome. But if it's not well managed, as with most risks, if it's not well managed, it can really have very important impacts on the economy. And for the financial sector in the Western Balkans, the transition, of course, away from coal power plants to greener sources of energy, it will require a fundamental shift in the investment strategies. And so this is something that's just, it's a unique challenge that the Western Balkans are facing, especially because the access to green finance and the need for policy frameworks to guide the transition is just still quite present. And so let's really stick with this understanding of transition risks also being an important aspect of climate-related risks. But having spoken a lot about all the risks that we're facing, I think has left maybe some of us, me certainly, with a bit of a worried sentiment. So let's dive into the next slide and talk a little bit about what can be done. I'll only touch on it because I know that there'll be a presentation that goes much deeper into what we can do afterwards. But let's just mention that there are some things that can be done, and of course, let's not forget that things are already being done both in Europe and the Western Balkans. And of course, at the core of that is climate risk management. So climate risk management is at the intersection of climate change adaptation here on the left, and disaster risk management on the right. And it's bringing those two together into a unified strategy. And the idea is to manage both the immediate climate impacts, but also the longer term effects of transitioning to a low carbon economy. I'll just quickly touch upon the key elements that are really important for climate risk management. So these include four aspects. It's integrated risk assessments, it's coordinated policy action, it's diversified investments, and it's cross-sector collaboration. So for integrated risk assessments, it's really important that the gradual climate changes, extreme events, and transition risks are combined into a risk assessment to get a comprehensive understanding of a country's vulnerabilities, and then, of course, in turn, of an individual sector and individual companies' vulnerabilities. When it comes to coordinated policy action, what we mean is that adaptation and disaster strategies need to be aligned. Cross-sectoral collaboration needs to be ensured and improved so that efforts are taking place in a coordinated and inclusive approach. And then, of course, the diversified investment bit, it relates to the need to shift investments to green technologies, but also really to shift investments to climate resilient infrastructure. Because if we don't plan in climate change from the get-go, and if we do not refit those infrastructure already in place to the most up-to-date scenarios, then we will end up facing a lot of challenges going forward. And let's go to the next slide, because in doing all of this, of course, one of the challenges is that we need to have the right information. And that's a challenge that we're facing really in the sector. It's the availability and the standardization of data. So in theory, we do know what information is needed for effective risk assessments, but the practice is that there are data gaps, and this is challenging. So for example, financial institutions, they often lack the localized data on how climate risks affect specific sectors or regions. And at the same time, even governments, who we would expect to have the data and information, they often struggle to access the information necessary for designing effective adaptation and disaster risk strategies. And so really for effective climate risk management, improving data sharing, improving and standardizing risk assessment methodologies, it's something we cannot skip. And it's really, we really need to make sure that stakeholders have access to high quality, reliable data, so that decisions can be informed and actually account for the increasing climate-related risks. And some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid, that's on the next slide. So some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid as we're trying to make progress in climate risk management, and that's really something that holds true anywhere where we're trying to progress in climate risk management, are the following. So one is a lack of foresight. Really failing to anticipate the risks can really lead to reactive and quite expensive strategies. So it's important that we proactively identify threats, because if we do not have this forward-looking approach, then we cannot keep up with the changes that climate change is making on risks on the landscape that we're facing. Another pitfall is the false perception of preparedness. So this is something that we've seen also in Germany, in the Ahr Valley, for example, but it's something that I think in many places we've seen. It's this overestimation of the readiness. Of course, preparedness plans are in place. Of course, measures have been taken. So there's a tendency to think that we'll be fine. it's been fine in the past anyway, so we'll be fine. But unfortunately, we will not be fine because a lack of foresight often is coupled with it. And so overestimating that readiness, it can really lead to neglect of evolving risks, can foster complacency, and it can result in weakening our resilience capacities. And also linked to that is, of course, the passing of responsibility. I was trying to make it really clear that climate resilience is a collective effort. It's not something that we can just pass on to our neighbors. It's not something we can just pass on to our governments. It's really something that everyone needs to take action on. And no one can do it quite on their own to tackle the whole issue. And that's also just in interconnected regions. That's something that's really important, that we have that in mind, that collaboration is crucial and that we cannot, we just cannot pass the responsibility to build resilience to others. And at the same time, of course, with all the efforts being made, we also cannot forget that there is one more pitfall that we need to avoid, and that's related to maladaptation. So just because we take action doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be having positive impacts more broadly. So maladaptation is really the issue where short-sighted solutions are worsening future vulnerabilities. So, for example, if you build flood defenses and you do not consider the impacts of the flood defense on the regions of the municipalities upstream, or on the impact of the flood defense downstream on, for example, agricultural water supplies, then you end up creating a situation that's shifting the risks rather than actually reducing them holistically. So these four pitfalls, let's avoid them: the lack of foresight, the false perceptions of preparedness, and the passing of responsibility, as well as maladaptation, and instead learn from past mistakes and aim for more holistic and forward-thinking approaches to managing climate-related risks. And I think that's a good point to lead over into any questions and reflections that you may have, but also, of course, into the presentation that will follow after this one. So with that, let me thank you for your attention, and let me lead over to the discussion that I think Hannah will moderate together with me.
Yes. Thank you so much, Teresa, for this very, very interesting presentation that I think very vividly highlighted the risks that we're actually facing, the challenges attached to them, and also what will happen if we don't act up on that. So I think you made that very clear, which we cannot hear often enough. What our future might look like if we don't take action now, or ideally yesterday. But with that, I would kindly invite you all to post your questions in the chat and make use of having this expert here with us today. And I think I will give you a little bit of time to think of questions, but I believe that Teresa will also stay on a little longer, also throughout the next part of our webinar. So if you come up with a question later, she will try to answer it also in the chat, but I think now ideally would be great if you have your question and pose it now, because then Teresa will be able to answer speaking, which obviously is better. Yes. So maybe think of something and yes, perfect. I see we have a first question from Antonio, which would be, are you aware if there is a climate adaptation roadmap for the Western Balkans?
So unfortunately, I'm not the expert on the Western Balkans specifically, but of course there are roadmaps in place. There's of course support through regional initiatives. I think there's a green agenda for the Western Balkans. And in that, I think, from what I recall, I think climate change adaptation, but also reducing greenhouse gas emissions are touched upon, and there's guidance for that. So it's not really, a comprehensive roadmap per se, but it's a sort of a roadmap. But I think Hannah, you and your team and Olga, you've been working a lot also on the Western Balkans specifically, so that may be something where you can also add further detail on.
Yes, thank you very much, Teresa. I personally am also not aware if there's a specific roadmap on climate adaptation, but maybe Olga could add on that.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, I'm also not the expert specifically in climate adaptation. In respect of the Western Balkans, therefore, I'm not aware whether there is a climate adaptation roadmap. But as Teresa mentioned, indeed there are the Green Agenda for Western Balkans. So there are some commitments which is like roadmap, and actually because of accession to the EU, there are some specific documents which have to be developed by the Western Balkans economies. For example, like the National Energy and Climate Plan. And this year it was adopted by all of the economies as far as I understand. So climate adaptation strategies should be a part of this as far as I understand. But I'm sorry, I'm not the expert in that.
I seem to recall that I think there's something currently in the making, but I don't, yeah, I think this is something we have to look in further, but I seem to recall that there's definitely a need for it, and that there is some support from international levels, from European levels, to go in this direction. But yeah, it's good that you're pointing it out also, I think, because that is a gap indeed. I'm seeing a hand from Antonio.
Thank you for the answer. Just to clarify, I'm aware that each country has to do a national adaptation plan, the NAP, as it's called by the UNFCCC requirement, and I think all countries are going in that direction. But the RCC shared a draft of a climate adaptation roadmap for the Western Balkans, like a regional one, few months ago. And I know there was the Western Balkans Summit in Berlin, and I haven't heard if the climate adaptation roadmap was adopted. So that's why I was asking if you maybe have the information on that. But there is certainly a draft of the climate adaptation roadmap for the Western Balkans for all 6 economies.
Yes, thank you for this comment. And actually, indeed, RCC is quite active also in implementation of the Green Agenda at the regional level. So in there, they have different activities in their action plan. So yeah, worth to check also their website and what they're doing there, honestly.
Yes, thank you, Olga, and thank you, Antonio, for this remark. And yeah, sorry, we're not currently aware if the adaptation has already been taken place, but I think we can also follow up on this in the aftermath of this webinar and could come back to you in case if that's of interest. And I also see that Mustafa posted a very interesting report as well that we also referred to, or Teresa referred to in her presentation, which is the World Bank report on country climate and development from the World Bank. And as you mentioned, Mustafa, it covers as well adaptation and mitigation strategies, and it's very interesting. So yeah, definitely have a look, and thank you for sharing the link also in the chat. So I think it might be relevant for everyone here in the room. And I also see that Laura has commented on your remark, Antonio. So maybe Laura, you could also step in with a little more insight on this, because yeah, I'm not entirely aware of what happened in Hamburg. Yeah, feel free to step in, and if not, everyone else feel free to follow up on Laura's comment.
Yeah, I just shared the information that I had based on the Hamburg Declaration in the chat, and that's the latest status quo that I have. So if anyone else here in the webinar has more information, of course, also please feel free to share.
Great, thank you so much, everyone, on sharing your insights. And I think also looking at the time, I would kindly move on to our next interactive part. But as I said, Teresa will still on a little longer, so feel free to still post your comments or remarks and questions in the chat, and we will make our best to follow up on them. So I will share my screen again and move back to our BCAS tool that we used before. So everyone just quickly mentioned, because I saw some people joined a little later. So we're trying to make this webinar a bit more interactive, and I'm kindly asking you to go to mybcas.com and enter the session code, which is displayed here again, to be able to participate in this exercise and also give us your insights on what is going on maybe in your regions. So in order to follow up a bit on Theresa's great presentation, we would be interested in learning a bit more on your personal level of knowledge in the field of climate risk. So just kindly indicate where you feel yourself presented in most, be it senior expert, intermediate knowledge, newcomer, or you've heard of it. Just to give us also a little bit more of an idea on upcoming webinars, where to start with, and maybe where we can direct our upcoming support to more. So great, I already received some answers being intermediate knowledge and newcomers, which I think is both great and very valuable, that you're making yourself for the first time maybe familiar or adding on existing knowledge. Great. Okay, thank you very much. So we have sort of a half-half situation between intermediate knowledge and newcomer. Thanks a lot for indicating. And with that, I would move on to our next question on the issue of climate risk. So we would be very interested in learning which climate risks you find most present in your region at the moment, or you consider the most urgent in general, maybe also forward-looking. So I'm going to start this webinar and this exercise, and I would kindly ask you to submit your answers in using the chat, the send your word function. Okay, I think we have, some of the most present ones already coming in, which is obviously floods, as we have also heard from Teresa, and I think most of us have experienced also actually, unfortunately, in their daily lives. So it would be floods and heat waves, droughts, sort of both ends are very, exercising danger on us. Earthquakes as well, we have here. Water scarcity, obviously, also as a consequence of extreme heat waves and droughts. Okay, great. Thank you for sending in your answers, and I think they're very compatible with, so personal experience is actually very compatible also with what the science tells us, or Teresa told us before about the urgency of climate risk and the presence already in the region. And yes, great to see all have already been mentioned. That's also valuable information. Thank you. Biodiversity loss also, of course, unfortunately, very often overlooked. But I'm grateful that it has been mentioned here, because obviously it's also a great risk and with tremendous consequences if not addressed in a suitable way. And fires also as well. Loss of habitats is sort of plays in biodiversity loss. Great. Thank you so much for your answers that keep on coming in, but I think still looking at the time, I will kindly ask the next presenter to step in and Nina to share the presentation, and Radman to kick off your presentation if possible. Yes, we can see the slides, and yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Radmans-Helmet, to also be joining us today and telling us a bit more from your perspective about the issue of management of climate risk in the financial sector. And with that, I would hand over to you. And yeah, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Hannah, for the kind words. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Radman Šelmić, and I'm advisor to the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Serbia, in charge of green and circular economy and also digital transformation. And also, I have to say thanks to Teresa for this great presentation, which is very rich, very thoughtful. It's not easy to be presenter after such a thoughtful presentation. She touched upon many very good points, but I also would say that my presentation somehow is a good continuation. My presentation is compatible with her, and we can go to the next slide. Teresa, with good reasons, focused on physical risks in relation to climate changes, so physical risk, but also she rightly mentioned transition risk. And I would start somehow with the transition risk, and not in any abstract terms, but very concrete terms. So let's go in medias res and start with CBAM. I believe that most of you know what it is, or at least heard about it. So it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which EU Commission introduced 2023 in October, and which is actually one regulation which does require for the rest of the world, for companies from the rest of the world, including, of course, Western Balkans 6, when they are exporting to the EU, to report about their so-called embedded emission. Okay, and why is that relevant? It's relevant because it's going to affect the export of the Western Balkans 6, and we at the moment don't know how much will be affected, but there are some rough figures. So instead of talking in abstract terms, I'm going more directly. What is transitional risk, for example, for the Western Balkans 6 countries, and how it's going to affect their GDP, and how it's going to affect their companies, and of course, financial sector, banks are at the very heart of every single economy in the world, and there's no way for banks to get aside, to avoid absorbing that sort of risk. So these are the figures from the study done by German Watch and Emission Trading Extra 2023. So the question is, first bar is proportion of export to the EU. Second bar is proportion of CBAM goods in the total share of export. And the third bar is proportion of CBAM goods as proportion of GDP. So, for example, for Serbia, rough estimate is that 4% of GDP could be one way or the other affected. Of course, it doesn't mean that our GDP is going to drop. It means it depends on how good the companies will adapt, and banks, of course, to the risk. I haven't mentioned that, as you probably know, that the sectors which will be affected are predominantly metal sector, aluminium, iron, steel, plus cement producers, plus fertilizer producers. And there are some hints from the EU Commission that the list of goods will be extended. So these figures could go just up. So that's important to understand what does transition risk mean, because we are aware, or maybe not to good extent, that we are actually living in a time where the changes are happening rapidly. And CBAM as I mentioned, was introduced last year, 2023, and companies will be paying for that at the beginning of 2026. For the EU, it took 15 years to properly introduce emission trading system. It started 2005 with a lot of changes in the meantime, and so on and so on. So CBAM is now a transition challenge and transition risk, which is happening very quickly, and we have to first of all understand it properly, and most of companies have to adapt. I'll be talking later a bit what are means, what are instruments for adaptation. But for the beginning, I also want to underline that we were approached by several banks who want, because we delivered a lot of trainings on CBAM to companies in Serbia and in the region. We were in Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on. So we were approached by banks who want to understand in depth that transition risk, precisely because in their credit portfolio, there are companies from the metal sector, or there are cement producers and so on, and who will be paying starting from 2026, and which export might be put in jeopardy to some extent. So could we go for the next slide? I now want to say a couple of words about the finance, that, let's say, nexus or interrelation between the private and public finance, and what is the situation in the Western Balkans 6. As you probably know, most of the banks, at least in Serbia, I believe it's very similar in the other Western Balkan 6 countries, economies have their headquarters in the EU. And most of activities are credits or project finance at the moment related to renewable energy. So I would say that banks, at least in Serbia, are a bit hesitant to credit green activities, activities of green economy in a more intense terms. Also, what is unfortunately the case in Serbia, there's no state investment bank. I believe that state investment banks are very important for green transformation. Their role in economy and their role in the financial sector has been confirmed after the credit crunch, and then once again in the corona pandemics, and then once again during the green transition, because green transition or green transformation is so demanding in terms of the volume of the finance, and also in terms of the character of the finance, because we need a patient finance. It's not just the volume of finance. So the role of state investment banks are vital. And we see that in the EU countries, and for the Western Balkan 6 economies, some economies have the state investment banks. Unfortunately, I'm saying Serbia doesn't have it. Also, what is the problem is lack of properly developed capital market and green financial instruments. For example, green corporate bonds. I have to say that fortunately, through a program with the World Bank, our Serbian Ministry of Finance decided to subsidize issuance of green corporate bonds for companies. I believe that's a very good measure. And we, in the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Serbia, had a workshop on green corporate bonds last November, and there was a huge interest among banks and among companies, because there are some technical details which are not easy to be understood. For example, you can refinance your loan through issuance of green corporate bonds. So there are some tricky details which only professionals. Also, we were told at that point in November, some CEOs of companies said, oh, we should have known about this a bit earlier. So issuance of, once again, of green corporate bonds could be a method, could be an instrument, could be a strategy for companies to address their internal green transformation, to get finance, to get investment for internal green investment, for change of technology, and so on. Can we go for the next slide? As I said, most of the banks have their headquarters in the EU. It's positive. On a positive side, banks operating in the Western Balkans 6 have their targets, which are set in their headquarters in terms of their green portfolio. That's, of course, good and usually ambitious. But problem is, at least problem which we identified and experienced in Serbia, is that you cannot channel down all the knowledge from your headquarters with all due respect. So you have to have local guys who are experienced in risk management. And the problem now is, as I already mentioned or referred to, we are living in a time where transformation, technological, financial, legal, and any other is so quick that there are new disciplines such as, for example, circular economy, where it's not easy to get an expert. And if you want to have a loan or credit for circular economy, you have to have internal knowledge. You have to have a guy in your risk management who understands business models for circular economy. If that company wants to change from linear towards circular model, and they have developed some sort of new business model, you have to have internal knowledge and expertise within the bank in your risk management to say whether that business plan is valuable or not, whether that business plan is going to really bring circularity into the model of operating of concrete company or not. So we identified that problem, and I'm happy to say, proud of course, that last year we, within the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Serbia, organized a daily, one-day workshop for banks, mostly for banks, and with the support of GIZ, the German government organization, and our partners were Ernst & Young. Also, there was a huge appetite, huge interest among banks to see and understand all the, let's say, climate and environment-related risk. I would not say just climate, so climate and environment-related risk. And the focus was on not only listing and understanding risk, but also on their operational, let's say, functionality. So circular economy was also there and mentioned. Could we go on the next slide, please? And now we are getting to the list of risks. Teresa explained properly physical risk. Of course, they're related to all sorts of businesses, predominantly, let's say, agro-businesses, food production would be most directly affected. But with the climate changes, all sorts of businesses are affected. If we experience heat wave, as we experienced, for example, this summer in Serbia, and I would say in the whole Western Balkans 6, of course, your energy production is going higher, your electricity production is going higher. If you're producing food or any other sensitive material goods, you have to adapt the temperature of your factory. You have to maybe the chain or that supply chain. Also, one thing which is usually underestimated, it's transferred into financial risk, but health risk. We don't talk, in my opinion, enough about the health, about the people, what brings, what sort of risk. Of course, climate changes, extreme heat waves are bringing to people who have to work under certain conditions, and so on and so on. Of course, well-being and health of people has to be paramount, but we shouldn't underestimate financial effects and pressure on the budget, on the national health system, and so on. Transition risks I started with them because once again, regulatory framework is changing very quickly. with a lot of consequences. Once again, CBAM, because I'm sure that it's the most, at the moment, the most challenging and most demanding transition risk. And if you say, okay, how much is going to cost economy, I would say nobody knows, because at the moment, nobody has done a proper study, or at least I haven't seen it. And there is one particular reason, which is also exemplary. It's also good illustration. EU Commission changed methodology for calculating how much companies will be paying starting after the transition period, starting from 2026. So it happened, I believe, 2 months ago. So or if anybody calculated before that, it's not valid anymore. And also, if one company doesn't follow the very specific rules or very specific information about the CBAM, they can easily be misguided, or they can make a wrong calculation how much they will be paying. So that's the reason why I'm talking about that ongoing changes in terms of regulatory and legal framework, in terms of carbon tax obligations and so on. Also, understanding risk related to carbon markets. I just explained how everything changed 2 months ago because EU Commission changed the methodology, and companies which are obliged to pay will be paying more than we thought 3 months ago or 6 months ago. And also, we don't know at the moment to what other industries this transition risk will extend. There are some hints that it will go towards transport and so on. And in a long run, of course, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, will be a mirror image of emission trading systems. So all industries which are affected at the moment, which are within the emission trading system in the EU, will be after 2034 will be included within the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just quickly, climate-related risks and opportunities and financial impact. A lot of these things have been mentioned, but let's go briefly. So in terms of transition risk, of course, policy and legal, I like to talk more to concrete examples rather than in abstract terms. Technology, of course, technology was not mentioned today. I believe it's very important, because if company says, okay, we understood that we won't be competitive on the EU market starting from 2026, and what we're going to do? There's no million ways for them to adapt, to address that risk. They have to address the business processes, maybe their business model. They have to invest, ideally, in new technology, which new technology would enable them to reduce their emissions. So following technological trends, adapting technology or not adapting is a risk. Then market risk. Most obviously, keeping your market position in the local and in the international market. 70% of Serbian trade exchanges with the EU. And of course, there's a reputation risk for banks, for companies. Customers are getting more and more aware of all the environmental aspects, and they're more, let's say, self-aware and demanding when they're buying. Physical risk we mentioned. Acute could be floods or droughts or extreme heat waves, and there are chronic climate-related risks. It might sound a bit pathetic when we say that where there is risk, there is opportunity, but I believe it's true. So the way to understand risk and to address also gives you an opportunity. Circular economy was mentioned few times in my presentation. I believe it's very important. It's usually underestimated because it's not only our obligation on the level of public policies, which we in the Western Balkan accepted through Green Agenda for the Western Balkan. It's also very reasonable and practical to implement on the level of company models of circular economy. Of course, predominantly because of protecting environment, but it could be profitable. It could be beneficial in very financial terms. We are living in the world where resources, the price of minerals, price of sources are going up. It's volatile. It's getting more and more volatile. So to avoid that sort of uncertainty, you can try to use somebody's industrial waste as your raw material. So that sort of resource efficiency. Now I'm making a digression and going a bit higher in terms of my explanation. So yes, resource efficiency. Try to be very aware of resources you're using. Try to be very efficient. Energy efficiency as well. Try to switch to renewable energies in order to reduce your emission and to address the risk of your competitiveness within the company. But also try to, as I mentioned, use the principles of industrial symbiosis. It means somebody's industrial waste could easily be somebody's raw material. Of course, it's not always easy. It's easier to be said than to be done. But we in Serbia are trying to develop that sort of industrial symbiosis precisely because of the environmental aspects, but also when companies are using somebody's industrial waste as a raw material, they are reducing their overall emissions. So they are addressing risk of their competitiveness. And CBAM, as a measure from the EU, is pushing companies towards that internal transformation. Okay, then products and services. If you are adapting and making your product sustainable, of course, you are improving your market position and your position in the perspective of clients and customers. You are making your market position stable. And if you are making your position also resilient, because of course, numerous companies, at least in the Western Balkans 6, have to adapt their business process. They have to change to less or a bigger extent some of their ways they have been doing business and have been producing. It is as if you are refurbishing your flat. But when you're refurbishing your flat, try to do some long-term plans. Try to think about your needs. What would you like and where would you be in 10, 20, 30 years? Because you have to do refurbishment. You have to change and adapt your business process anyway. And what are the financial impacts? Yes, income statement, cash flow statement, balance sheets, and so on. But also and substantially try to address the risk of your competitiveness by thinking that internal investments are not just cost. They are long-term. They could lead and would lead to long-term profitability because we have to think about sustainability and profitability together. They're going hand in hand. Can I get next one?
Radman, sorry to interrupt. I just want to point to the time, and we can because the webinar is scheduled to end at 12 o'clock. We can definitely go a few minutes over time. Just you keep in mind to move to maybe the most urgent parts you still want to mention. So don't want to stress you, and sorry that we have to cut fine. A little bit.
Maybe my initial digressions were too long. Green bonds were mentioned. We can skip this one. Let's go to another slide. Okay, what would be advice for companies and for banks in relation to, let's say, ESG related risks, environment, social, and governance. Within this acronym, of course, many of the things we have discussed are there. So both for banks and for companies, try first to understand in depth the risk, try to introduce or develop methodology of risk, which is complementary to the existing risk methodology, for example, for banks. Think about new capital adequacy ratio, because these new risks maybe do require additional capital. And also try to think and integrate ESG-related risk with the existing risk strategy or methodology. And also importantly, for banks predominantly, but also for companies, you have to think about risk and addressing risk along all sectors, which means operational risk, reputational risk, profitability risk, also liquidity risk, and market risk. Okay, can we go to the next one? These are just different methodologies for reporting. We can skip this one. Can we go to next one? No, sorry, the previous one. That one. Okay, good. So I mentioned risk management. Let's maybe talk just a couple of words in concrete examples from the perspective of a bank. Let's think about investment in real estate. If you're thinking, or from the perspective both of the bank and the company, if you're investing in real estate business and these flat houses and so on, or business real estate, if they are properly energy efficient, if they are developed in accordance with the most demanding and the highest standards in terms of energy efficiency, then you're of course in a good position. If you are not, then the value of your collateral would go down. The same is for the company. If the company internally invests in the factory, which is developed as a building in accordance with the most demanding standards in terms of energy efficiency, then the value of collateral is growing. So if company wants to use that collateral to get a loan, what risk usually translate? It translate in very tangible results, like lower profitability, lower value of assets. I just mentioned the most concretely. So the real estate, if you don't understand necessity to develop real estate, as I said, in accordance with the energy efficiency standards, then the price will go down. A lower purchasing power of our clients, and higher regulatory requirements, and higher legal costs. Can we go to the next one? And I will finish in maybe 2-3 minutes. Banks have to understand that their portfolio now brings new risks. And as I said, these risks are physical risk and transition risk. So banks have to understand that doing business as usual is not an option anymore. If they are lending to, for example, I don't know, agricultural business, they have to understand physical climate risk. If they're lending to the metal sector, they have to understand also the risk in relation to emission of CO2. So what are the overall emissions of that factory? It could be very stable, it could be very profitable company from the metal sector at the moment. But the fact is that their production is a bit obsolete, and the level of their so-called embedded emission is higher or much higher than the EU standard. The consequence is that simply once they start paying, starting from 2026, they won't be competitive. If the bank has already landed a loan in terms of 5 years or 10 years, the bank will be in trouble. So start thinking about CO2 emissions in monetary terms. That's advice both for banks and for companies. And as you know, probably there are 3 scopes of emission for every company and for every bank. Scope number 1 is emissions at the very factory site. Scope number 2 are so-called indirect emissions. Where is your electricity coming from? Unfortunately, in Serbia and in some other economies in the Western Balkans 6, energy mix is very unfavorable with a lot of electricity coming from coal thermal power. And scope 3 are transport and other elements. But importantly, scope 3 for banks is their credit portfolio. So they have to think about scope 3 because more than 55% of their emissions are coming from their portfolio. And when the regulatory framework is getting more and more strict within the EU, it's going to get tougher for banks to defend their decisions. So they have to think wisely in terms of where their credits are going at the moment, and to start thinking about CO2 emissions once again, not only in environmental terms, but also in monetary terms. And can we go down? I want to say a couple of words about central banks. So, and I'm finishing with that. A couple of slides down. State Investment Bank were mentioned. Okay, this one. So when we talk about risk, of course, once again, banks are at the very heart of the financial system, or more precisely at the broader economic infrastructure. Whatever risk we experience in economy, sooner or later, banks will be affected. So the risk will be reflected there. What is the role of central banks? That's a topic in itself for new workshop or debate or discussion. But I want to say that I took that headline, Christine Lagarde, president of the ESB, 6 ESB green targeted lending. So central banks, what does that mean? It means that central bank would offer cheaper borrowing to commercial banks if they promise to invest into the green projects. So some sort of favorable, or let's say subsidized lending in terms of lower low interest rate, would go from the very top, from the very center of the financial system, that is from the central bank. I'm in favor of that. There are central banks in the world which are doing that already. I believe China, Japan, and some other, because we are all facing green transformation, which brings a lot of risks, physical, transition risks, and the central banks are at the very heart of the financial system. So the way we address in our society, in our economy, all the risks, or the way we not address them properly, will sooner or later be reflected in the position of the central bank, which of course has its own measures to prevent some sort of risks within the commercial banks, but also has to absorb some sort of risks from the commercial banks. So I would conclude with that. The role of central banks cannot be underestimated. And maybe just the final one to carbon accounting. Sorry, one more slide and I'm done. No, go down. Okay, this one. So I believe that we need knowledge. Let me finish on positive terms or something which we do need. So in addition to proper finance and understanding financial risk, in addition to support from, let's say, state investment bank, commercial banks, what I think that we need knowledge to understand, not to understand the proportion and challenges of green transition overall, and in particular risks. And for that, we need carbon accounting in addition to, let's say, traditional financial accounting, because carbon accounting and traditional financial accounting are intertwined in order to, once again, understand all the risks in the financial system, in the economy, in society. We need more understanding, more knowledge of this relatively new discipline, carbon accounting, in addition to circular economy, which was mentioned a few times. And I'm finishing with that. Sorry for a bit of extension of my presentation, but I'm done.
Thank you very much, Ratman, for this great presentation. And I'm really sorry you had to rush through it. I hope everyone will take the time and look through it online, because we're going to post the whole presentation, obviously, on our website in combination with today's recording. So as I put in the chat already, please, if you now have any urgent question to Ratman, post them in the chat so we can quickly address them. Because if not, and considering we already went a little bit into overtime, I would hand over to Olga to finish up with our webinar. Thanks again to both of you great speakers today and for making the time. Also, thanks to the speakers, but also for our participants today and the questions we received. And with that, yeah, maybe Olga can conclude some final remarks.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Ratman, for this presentation, and thank you to everyone for staying a little bit longer with us. Yeah, I hope that we have managed to deliver the key messages with that the need for the regional cooperation. And you see that in Serbia, a lot is going on, and please indeed check the presentation, because there are some further examples on what is ongoing, the activities and initiatives for climate risk management, and that climate risks do not have borders. And I think that after this webinar, it will be easier for you to differentiate more between physical and transitional risks. And yeah, so many thanks for Hannah and Nina for organizing and staying for managing everything online. And we will be happy to welcome you on our further webinars. And the next webinar will be in the first quarter of next year. And most probably it will be on EU funding programs. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.